Welcome back to our shared storytelling space. Returning early from an out-of-state engineering assignment, I froze in disbelief to discover my wife, who had undergone an invasive cesarean section delivery less than 3 weeks prior, neglected and starved by my own mother for 5 consecutive days. "I am the mother of this house, not your personal maid," she had snapped at her. Without a second thought, I packed my wife and newborn daughter into the car, drove them straight to my in-laws, and spoke a single sentence that drained every drop of color from my mother's face. My out-of-state work deployment in Columbus, Ohio, was originally scheduled to last 3 full weeks. Yet on the 14th day, after nearly 2 consecutive sleepless nights alongside our automation team, our high-speed sorting system at an industrial logistics facility finally stabilized, and the regional director signed off on early acceptance. The moment my project supervisor informed me that I could head to the airport for an afternoon flight back to Pennsylvania, the first thing on my mind was not catching up on sleep, but the exhausted, radiant face of Mallory and our newborn daughter, Hazel, who was not even 3 weeks old. I decided not to call ahead. I wanted to unlock the front door quietly, savor the look of joyful surprise on my wife's face, and finally cradle my baby girl in my arms after endless days of staring at them through a small smartphone screen. On the drive home from the international airport outside Philadelphia, I stopped at a local artisanal bakery to pick up a box of the low-sugar almond croissants Mallory loved, a small bouquet of fresh wildflowers, and a cream-colored organic cotton onesie she had sent me a photograph of right before I boarded my departing flight 2 weeks prior. During those 2 weeks away, I received daily text messages from my wife's cellular number. Some days it was just a few comforting words. "Hazel and I are doing wonderfully, honey. Stay focused on your engineering tests." Other days, it read, "Your mother is taking such good care of us. Please do not worry at all." Those messages brought me immense peace of mind, reinforcing my belief that I had made the right decision by having Mallory stay at our family home in the suburban outskirts of Westchester with my mother, rather than temporarily moving in with her parents. It was nearly noon when I pulled into our quiet residential cul-de-sac on Sycamore Ridge Lane. The late summer air was warm and humid, and the neighborhood was quieter than usual. Rolling my suitcase up the paved stone walkway toward our 2-story colonial house, I pictured hearing my mother's voice calling out from the open kitchen, and Mallory playfully scolding me for not giving them advance notice. Yet the moment I stepped onto the front porch, an uneasy sensation settled in my chest. 2 overfilled, black, heavy-duty trash bags sat tied beside the porch railing, clearly left uncollected from days prior. The front door was unlatched, resting slightly ajar. Inside, the house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, hollow hum of the ceiling fans spinning in the foyer. "Mallory, honey, I am home," I called out into the hallway. There was no answer. I called again, louder, but the ground floor remained eerily still. My mother's sedan was not parked in the driveway either. Leaving my suitcase beside the coat rack, I took the stairs 2 at a time to the 2nd floor. Halfway down the carpeted hallway, I heard a baby whimpering. It was not the robust, full-throated cry I had grown accustomed to hearing during our earlier hospital days. It was a raspy, intermittent whimper, the sound of an infant who had wept for hours until her tiny lungs were completely spent. I pushed open the master bedroom door and stopped dead in my tracks. Mallory was sitting propped up against the headboard, cradling Hazel in the crook of one arm while her trembling hand lightly patted the baby's back. Her hair was damp with sweat at her temples, her lips were chapped and pale, and her cheeks already thin after a difficult delivery had sunk drastically. Dark, purplish circles ringed her eyes, testifying to days without restorative rest. On the nightstand beside her sat an almost empty plastic water pitcher, an open box of generic whole wheat crackers, an opened carton of almond milk, and a small bowl of leftover oatmeal so cold that a thick, rubbery film had congealed over its surface. Mallory looked up. For a fleeting second, I thought she would smile with relief, but her voice cracked with sheer panic. "Why are you home today, Garrett?" I rushed to her bedside. Before I could ask a single question, Mallory tried to swing her legs over the edge of the mattress to stand up. The moment her bare feet touched the hardwood floor, she swayed dangerously, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the wooden bedpost. I caught her by the shoulders, asking in horror what was wrong. She merely shook her head weakly. "I just stood up too fast, that is all." I looked down at her wrists. In only 14 days, her arms had withered. When did you last eat a warm, proper meal, Mallory? She lowered her gaze and said nothing. Her silence felt like a physical blow to my chest. Setting the flowers and the pastry box onto the dresser, I told her to stay seated and marched straight downstairs to the kitchen. The stainless steel cookware on the range was spotless and bone dry. On the quartz island, not a single plate or covered dish had been set aside. I pulled open the French door refrigerator. The shelves were stocked with chicken cutlets, salmon fillets, fresh eggs, produce, and yogurt. But 3 plastic glass meal prep containers on the middle shelf were sealed with blue painter's tape, bearing my mother's rigid, unmistakable handwriting in black permanent marker. Judith's dinner, do not touch. Save for tomorrow. I stared at those handwritten labels for several long seconds, completely unable to reconcile what I was seeing with the cheerful, reassuring text messages that had pinged on my phone every single evening. I walked back upstairs, forcing my voice to remain steady. Mallory, look at me and tell me the truth. What have you been eating these past few days? Mallory kept her gaze fixed on our daughter. It took a long, suffocating minute before she whispered, I have not had a proper, hot meal in 5 days. I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. She explained that some mornings there was leftover toast. Other days she managed to boil a small pot of dry noodles if the surgical pain allowed. But whenever Hazel had a prolonged colic spell, and she made it downstairs late, whatever had been prepared was already packed away or finished. For the past 2 days, she had survived almost entirely on dry crackers, protein bars, and sips of room-temperature milk. A rush of heat surged to the crown of my head. Last night, you texted me saying Mom was simmering a pot of chicken and vegetable soup for you. Mallory looked up, her expression completely hollow. I never sent that text message. Garrett. The bedroom fell into dead silence. Where is your cell phone? I asked, my pulse pounding in my ears. Mallory nodded toward the locked drawer of the vanity table across the room. Your mother took it the morning after you departed. She told me that digital screens cause postpartum optical strain, that blue light and cellular frequencies are hazardous around a newborn, and that I needed to disconnect completely to heal. I walked over and yanked the vanity drawer. It was firmly locked. At that moment, the cold dread gripping me went far beyond the realization that my wife had been neglected. I suddenly realized that for 2 whole weeks, I had never once been speaking to my wife. Just then, the front door downstairs clicked open. My mother had returned. I walked down the stairs. My mother, Judith, was setting a brown paper grocery bag full of organic fruit on the island. She was dressed impeccably in a pressed linen blouse and tailored slacks, her hair neatly styled as if she had just returned from a social luncheon. When she turned and saw me standing in the open living room, she froze visibly. Garrett? What on earth are you doing back? Was your project not supposed to wrap up late next week? Before I could answer, slow, dragging footsteps sounded on the stairs behind me. Mallory was inching her way down, one hand clamped tightly around the wooden banister, wincing with every step as her abdominal surgical incision pulled. My mother glanced past me, her brow furrowing in instant irritation. Did I not tell you to stay in bed? What are you dragging yourself down here for? I stepped between them, looking directly into my mother's eyes. Mom, what has Mallory had to eat for the past 5 days? Judith paused for 2 seconds, set her designer purse on the counter, and crossed her arms. There is plenty of food in the pantry and the refrigerator. If she is hungry, she has 2 working legs to walk down and prepare something. I did not tie her to the mattress. I struggled to keep my voice from trembling with rage. She had an invasive cesarean section less than 3 weeks ago. The baby cries through the night, and she is up alone all day trying to nurse. Half the time she cannot even stand upright without severe dizzy spells. My mother's face instantly darkened with righteous indignation. When I had you and your sister 30 years ago, I was back on my feet cooking dinners and doing laundry by day 3. Women nowadays have 1 single child and act like the world owes them an all-inclusive resort vacation. Mallory stood behind me, trembling, her face completely drained of color. My mother looked right past my shoulder, glaring directly at my wife, and delivered the exact words that will forever remain seared into my memory. I am the mother of this house, not your personal maid. I stood absolutely motionless. I did not yell. I did not slam my fist on the counter. I simply looked at the woman who had raised me for over 30 years, seeing her with terrifying clarity for the very first time. Slowly, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my father-in-law. Douglas? It is Garrett. Could you and Colleen please get the ground floor guest room ready for Mallory and Hazel? I am packing their bags and bringing them over to your place this afternoon. Judith's face instantly lost its smug composure. Her voice rose into a sharp screech. What do you think you are doing? I ended the call, tucked my phone back into my pocket, and met her furious gaze. If preparing a warm bowl of soup for a recovering surgical patient who just gave birth to your granddaughter feels like being a maid to you, then from this moment on, you will never have to serve my wife again. Standing in that kitchen, I could not help but wonder how our family dynamic had deteriorated to such an extreme point. If someone had turned back the clock more than 6 years to the day I first brought Mallory home to meet my family, I would never have imagined that the woman my mother once praised would one day be treated like an adversary to be conquered. Nor could I have anticipated that my own persistent desire to remain the neutral peacemaker would blind me until the cracks in our home became an irreparable chasm. I met Mallory when we both worked at a regional engineering and manufacturing firm in the Mid-Atlantic area. I worked in industrial automation, spending more time on assembly floors than at a desk, while Mallory worked as a certified corporate accountant. She was not the loud, flamboyant type who commanded the room, nor was she overly charming in a performative way. But from our very first corporate project together, I admired her unwavering integrity, her sharp mind, and her quiet independence. We dated for nearly 2 years before deciding to marry. During our courtship, Mallory never pressured me to buy an expensive suburban property of our own right away. She knew my father had passed away from cardiovascular disease when I was barely 20 years old, leaving my mother to raise my younger sister, Brooke, and me largely on her own. Mallory was empathetic, often telling me that if we shared the family home initially, she would do everything in her power to ensure my mother never felt discarded or replaced. That generosity of spirit convinced me that I had found the perfect life partner. Following my father's passing, my mother, Judith, had managed the household with an iron fist. She was fiercely independent, thrifty to a fault, and deeply opinionated. Back then, I viewed her authoritarian streak simply as the natural armor of a widow who had carried the burdens of single parenthood for decades. Out of filial love and respect, I rarely pushed back against her decisions. If she had a preference, as long as it was not unreasonable, I deferred to her to keep the peace. When I first introduced Mallory, Judith seemed more than pleased. She questioned Mallory thoroughly regarding her career trajectory, her financial habits, and her family background. Later that evening, she told me approvingly, "She is sensible, she has a stable corporate career, and she knows how to respect family traditions. She will keep our home in order." That night, Judith was the one who served Mallory the largest portion of roast beef at Sunday dinner. After our wedding, we settled into the spacious 2-story colonial home my parents had purchased decades earlier in Chester County. The title of the house had been transferred into my name after my father's estate was settled, but Judith continued to live with us on the main floor, an arrangement that both Mallory and I initially embraced as standard family solidarity. Mallory commuted to the corporate office daily and consistently contributed her half to the household groceries, property taxes, and utility bills. On weekends, if my mother experienced a migraine or a sudden blood pressure spike, Mallory was the one who drove her to the urgent care clinic and picked up her prescriptions at the local pharmacy. During the first 2 years of our marriage, our home was peaceful. Judith would often brag to our relatives at Thanksgiving dinner, "My daughter-in-law is so respectful, she never raises her voice." At the time, I foolishly believed my mother was proud of Mallory's character. I failed to recognize that what Judith valued most was not Mallory's kindness, but the intoxicating sensation of absolute compliance. The friction began in the smallest, most insidious ways. Judith was an early riser, habitually awake by 5:30 in the morning, and she firmly believed that any respectable homemaker should adhere to the exact same routine. Even on Sunday mornings, she expected Mallory to be downstairs before 6 in the morning to brew the coffee, tidy the living area, and prepare breakfast before sitting down. Mallory worked long hours during corporate quarterly closings, often returning home past 8 in the evening. One Saturday, she gently remarked, "Judith, if we do not have any urgent errands tomorrow, I would love to sleep in until 7:30 in the morning just to recharge." My mother did not argue openly. She merely gave a thin, patronizing smile and muttered, "Young professionals these days certainly have it easy compared to our generation." I thought the matter was settled, but a few days later, while talking to a neighbor across the front lawn, Judith casually commented within earshot, Young women nowadays earn a modest paycheck and suddenly think they can lounge in bed until the midday sun hits their face. When I overheard this and asked my mother not to make such unfair comments since Mallory carried more than her share of the household responsibilities, Judith immediately brushed it off with an airy wave. "Oh, Garrett, it was just a light-hearted joke. Why do you make such a massive drama out of everything?" Another subtle shift occurred when my mother learned that Mallory maintained a separate personal savings account for her direct deposits. In Judith's traditional mindset, once a woman was married, household finances should be consolidated and managed primarily by the husband. "A woman with too much disposable cash in her own account gets reckless with spending," she asserted one evening over herbal tea. I intervened immediately, making it clear that Mallory and I had mutually agreed on a transparent financial plan. We contributed proportionally to a joint household fund while keeping individual discretionary savings. "Mallory earns her own salary, Mom. There is zero reason for her to surrender her personal earnings to me." Judith fell silent, but her jaw tightened. From that day forward, passive-aggressive remarks became a regular fixture. Whenever I supported Mallory in a minor household discussion, my mother would let out a bitter little chuckle. "You have certainly changed since getting married, Garrett. In the old days, you valued my advice. Now you have to seek permission from your wife for every little thing." I would laugh it off, reassuring myself that this was merely the standard, possessive jealousy common among mothers who were overly attached to their sons. I failed to see that the perceived loss of authority but as a rival who had severed my loyalty to her. The most insidious part was that Judith rarely staged an open confrontation when I was in the room. When Mallory and she were alone during the day, she would criticize my wife's cooking, make snide remarks about her housekeeping, or question her family values. But the moment my vehicle pulled into the driveway, my mother's demeanor transformed instantly into warm hospitality, sweetly asking Mallory how her workday had been. Consequently, whenever Mallory tried to confide in me, I found it difficult to grasp the severity of the problem. One evening, Mallory leaned against me in bed and whispered, "Garrett, I am not afraid of strict routines or different habits. What terrifies me is that your mother presents one face to you and an entirely different face when we are alone." I vividly remember wrapping my arm around her, kissing her forehead, and replying, "Mom is just getting older, honey. Her communication style can be a little sharp, but she means well. Whenever something bothers you, just tell me, and I will mediate between you two." That promise sounded noble and mature at the time, but in hindsight, playing the perpetual mediator is often nothing more than a coward's compromise. Instead of holding the wrongdoer accountable, I repeatedly asked the more reasonable person to swallow her grievances, simply to preserve a fragile facade of domestic peace. Because I defended Mallory on obvious black and white issues, she never demanded that we move out. And because she stayed patient, I became complacent, convincing myself that our family tensions were merely normal generational differences that would eventually smooth themselves out over time. I never believed my mother had malice in her heart. She had sacrificed so much to put Brooke and me through college after my father died, working double shifts and scrimping on every personal comfort. In my mind, a mother who had demonstrated such fierce maternal dedication could never truly inflict deliberate cruelty upon my wife. That misguided faith was the very reason I felt completely secure leaving Mallory in her care when our daughter was born. There was one chilling incident prior to Mallory's pregnancy that I completely dismissed at the time. One afternoon, while working in the garage, I overheard my mother chatting with an acquaintance on the front porch. "My daughter-in-law is young and headstrong. She thinks she has everything figured out right now. But mark my words, once she has a baby, she will finally understand who actually commands the authority in this household." I had walked out of the garage, chuckling, and said, "Mom, stop talking like we live in the 19th century. She had laughed along, replying, "Oh, that is just women's talk, Garrett. Do not meddle." We moved on to another topic. Only years later did I realize that my mother had never been joking. Mallory and I spent several years trying to conceive. While it never pushed us into despair, the journey was long and emotionally draining enough that every well-meaning inquiry from extended relatives at Thanksgiving and Christmas gatherings felt like a dull ache. So on that crisp autumn morning when Mallory walked out of the bathroom holding a pregnancy test with 2 distinct pink lines, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly dropped it, I stood frozen in the hallway for several seconds before the reality washed over me. I remember holding her as she laughed through streaming tears, overwhelmed by the miraculous realization that a child was finally coming into our home. When we shared the news with Judith, she was ecstatic. For the first few weeks, whenever she returned from the organic grocery market, she brought back prenatal snacks, fortified juices, and specialty teas. She would even call my engineering office during lunch just to ask if Mallory was experiencing morning sickness. Yet that initial excitement soon morphed into an obsessive need for control. Judith began monitoring every morsel of food Mallory consumed, the exact hour she went to bed, and even the prenatal supplements prescribed by her obstetrician. If my mother read an unverified social media post or heard folklore claiming that certain foods cause complications, she would immediately attempt to ban them from the kitchen. One evening, as Mallory was taking her doctor-prescribed iron and folate supplements, Judith grilled her aggressively. "What are those capsules? Who authorized them? Are you certain they will not harm the baby's development?" Mallory disliked conflict, so she usually offered calm explanations. But when it came to medical directives, she was firm. "Judith, I am following the instructions of my board, certified obstetrician. She is monitoring my blood panels, and I intend to follow her clinical protocol." That reasonable boundary deeply offended my mother. In Judith's mind, she had successfully delivered 2 healthy babies 30 years ago. How dared a modern clinical printout supersede her maternal wisdom? On another occasion, Judith brewed a pungent herbal concoction she had bought from an unlicensed vendor, insisting Mallory drink it daily to purify her system. Mallory politely declined, stating that her physician advised against unverified herbal remedies during gestation. That evening, Judith sat through dinner in stony silence, later remarking bitterly to Brooke on the phone that young women today worshipped medical textbooks and thought their elders were ignorant. True to my established pattern, I stepped into the middle. I told my mother not to push, while quietly asking Mallory to soften her refusals. I believed I was diffusing tension, completely blind to the fact that I was merely forcing genuine grievances beneath the surface, where they festered. Mallory's pregnancy proceeded relatively smoothly until the 32nd week. During a routine ultrasound, the obstetrician noted that the baby remained in a persistent breech presentation with minor placental complications, indicating a very high likelihood of a scheduled cesarean section delivery if the position did not shift. Mallory grew anxious, and I began planning logistics for her postpartum recovery. My engineering role frequently required on-site deployments to manufacturing facilities across neighboring states, and I worried about leaving her unassisted. Hearing this, Mallory's parents stepped forward with a practical plan. Her mother, Colleen, had recently retired from her administrative career and had ample free time. She suggested that after Mallory was discharged from the hospital, both Mallory and the newborn could stay at their single-story home in nearby Malvern for about a month. There, Mallory could recover from major abdominal surgery without navigating stairs, surrounded by round-the-clock maternal support. Douglas, my father-in-law, wholeheartedly agreed. "We have an empty guest suite on the ground floor, and Colleen is home all day. It will relieve a tremendous amount of physical stress for Mallory." I found the proposal sensible and compassionate. A woman recovering from major surgery naturally feels more comfortable being assisted in intimate personal care by her own mother. Furthermore, it provided a safety net in case my company required me to travel on short notice. That evening, I broached the idea with Judith. Her reaction was explosive. She slammed her ceramic coffee mug onto the table. "I am alive and living right under this roof. If my daughter-in-law gives birth and immediately packs her bags to run off to her parents' house, what will our neighbors and relatives think? They will assume I am an incompetent, neglectful grandmother." I explained patiently that this was purely about Mallory's physical recovery and that no one was judging her character. But Judith refused to see reason. To her, having a postpartum daughter-in-law stay with maternal grandparents was a public indictment of our household's capabilities. "That baby carries our family name," she snapped. "Taking her away for an entire month the moment she is born is an utter disgrace." It became painfully obvious that Judith's primary concern was not Mallory's surgical recovery, but neighborhood optics and asserting ownership over the newborn. The following morning, Judith took it upon herself to call Colleen before I could even follow up. I did not hear the conversation, but Colleen later informed me that Judith had spoken with smooth, overwhelming charm. "Colleen, please do not worry yourself. Mallory is my daughter-in-law, and Hazel is my granddaughter. I am fully capable of managing the household and looking after them. You have worked hard your whole life. Enjoy your retirement." Unwilling to create a feud or appear possessive over the grandchild, Mallory's parents gracefully stepped aside. Mallory, exhausted by the debate, conceded that she would make the best of whatever arrangement kept the family peaceful. To ensure extra support, I offered to hire a certified postpartum doula and in-home caregiver for 4 hours each morning during the first month. Through a trusted professional referral, I found Janelle, an experienced in-home postpartum doula in her early 50s who had assisted dozens of families following cesarean section births. Her duties would include preparing nutritious meals, managing light baby laundry, and assisting Mallory with mobility while I was away. Mallory was immensely relieved, glad that the physical burden would not fall squarely on my mother. Judith, however, showed subtle disdain. While she did not openly veto the plan in front of me, her tone turned frosty. 3 capable adults under one roof, and we are paying good money to hire outside domestic help. Parenting today is absurdly pampered. I laughed it off, assuring her that having Janelle handle the heavy lifting would allow her to enjoy her granddaughter without fatigue. I paid Janelle an advance deposit for 2 weeks of service, agreeing that she would begin her morning shifts the day Mallory returned from the hospital. When the delivery date arrived, the surgery was performed as anticipated. I paced the sterile hospital waiting corridor for what felt like an eternity. When the labor nurse finally wheeled our daughter Hazel out into the hallway and placed her in my arms, my entire world narrowed to that tiny, fragile bundle. Her skin was a delicate rose, her hands impossibly small. In that singular instant, my priorities in this life shifted forever. During the 3 days in the maternity ward, my mother was the picture of a doting grandmother. She brought homemade broths, bought fresh-cut flowers, cradled Hazel, and snapped countless photos to text to extended family. Whenever Mallory attempted to adjust her hospital bed or reach for a glass of water, Judith would say warmly, "Just rest, Mallory. Let me handle everything." Watching them, I felt a deep sense of relief, chiding myself for ever doubting my mother's goodwill. When Colleen stopped by before discharge, Judith held her hand warmly. "Go home and relax, Colleen. She brought a beautiful granddaughter into our family. I will make sure she wants for nothing." Colleen left completely reassured, and I, too, believed every single word. 3 days after bringing Mallory and Hazel home, my corporate work phone rang. The automated logistics facility project in Columbus, Ohio, which I had engineered over the past 11 months, had suffered a critical software synchronization failure right before its final commissioning. The regional vice president requested that I travel to the job site immediately for an extended troubleshooting assignment. I stood out on the back patio with the phone pressed to my ear, a knot forming in my stomach. Inside, Hazel was sleeping peacefully beside her mother, and from the kitchen, Judith's voice drifted up the stairs, reminding Mallory to finish her warm oatmeal. At that moment, I genuinely believed I could leave home with peace of mind. That phone call arrived at the exact moment I thought I could take a short leave of absence to care for my wife. The project in Ohio involved a multi-million-dollar automated sorting facility for a national supply chain client. I had designed the programmable logic controller architecture and supervised the initial integration. The on-site team reported fatal communication lag between the primary barcode scanners and the high-speed divert conveyors. If the line could not pass acceptance testing within the week, our firm faced substantial liquidated damages and the forfeiture of a major corporate contract. During that initial call, I pleaded with my director to send another senior systems engineer. I stated clearly that my wife had delivered via major abdominal surgery less than 2 weeks prior and that my infant daughter needed me. But the engineering director leveled with me. "Garrett, the rest of the team only knows isolated modules. You built the entire logic architecture from scratch. If I send someone else, it will take them days just to read through the schematics. We estimate 3 weeks on site at most. If you resolve the synchronization early, you can fly home immediately." I hung up and sat on the patio steps for a long time. Through the open window, I heard Hazel's soft cooing and Mallory's gentle humming. A single interior wall separated me from my family. Yet the thought of being several states away filled me with deep apprehension. That evening, I laid everything out for Mallory. I offered to take an unpaid leave of absence, even if it meant risking my standing at the company. Mallory, ever practical, was the one who calmed my fears. She reminded me that this project was the culmination of a full year of grueling effort, and walking away would not only jeopardize my career, but also place an unfair burden on my junior engineering teammates. "You need to go and finish what you started, Garrett," she said softly. "We have your mother here. Janelle is starting tomorrow morning, and if I ever feel unwell, I promise I will call you immediately. Her selflessness made my heart ache. Still uneasy, I reiterated my earlier proposal. Let me drive you and Hazel to Malvern before I head to the airport. Your mom is home, your dad can help lift Hazel's bassinet, and you will not have to worry about navigating the stairs. Before Mallory could reply, Judith walked into the master bedroom, having overheard the conversation from the hallway. Her reaction was instantaneous and sharp. She claimed that sending Mallory to her parents the moment I left town would send a clear message to both families that she was deemed untrustworthy and unfit to care for her own family. Our family has lived in this community with dignity for generations, she argued. Taking my newborn granddaughter to another town while my son is working out of state will make our relatives think I abandoned you both. I tried to explain that this was solely about Mallory's physical recovery, but Judith viewed any deviation from her authority as an intolerable insult. Finally, she looked me dead in the eye and stated with unwavering conviction, "Go do your job, Garrett. I may not have your fancy modern parenting gadgets, but I am more than capable of cooking 3 hot meals a day for your wife. Hazel is my own flesh and blood. I would never let anyone in this house go hungry." That definitive promise dismantled my remaining hesitation. I reminded her that Janelle would arrive the following morning at 8:30 in the morning, which would significantly reduce the household chores. Judith nodded smoothly, noting that having someone handle the vacuuming and laundry would indeed be helpful. With both my mother and a paid postpartum doula in place, and with my in-laws only a short drive away in Malvern, I had no rational reason to believe Mallory would be left vulnerable. The evening before my departure, I stocked the kitchen with nearly 2 weeks' worth of fresh groceries. Lean poultry, Atlantic salmon, pasture, raised eggs, organic leafy greens, lactose-free milk, fresh fruits, and plenty of nutrient-dense snacks that Mallory enjoyed. I also ordered an extra case of lactation support protein drinks to help maintain her breast milk supply. In the master bedroom, I placed $500 in cash inside the top nightstand drawer in case Mallory needed anything delivered quickly. I gave my mother detailed instructions, perhaps with a level of precision that bruised her pride. I reminded her that Mallory was medically restricted from lifting heavy objects and should minimize climbing the stairs, and that if Hazel's feeding schedule caused Mallory to miss regular mealtimes, a portion of hot food should always be set aside in the warmer. Judith listened for a few minutes before cutting me off with an irritated sigh. "Garrett, I raised 2 children to adulthood before your wife was even born. I do not need my own son lecturing me on how to care for a new mother." I smiled and let it drop, chalking up her sharp tone to wounded maternal pride. Yet the following afternoon, as I was loading my luggage into the trunk of my sedan, my phone chimed with a text message from Janelle, the postpartum doula. She asked if our family's postpartum schedule had changed, explaining that my mother had just called her personal cell phone to state that her services would not be needed for the time being. Surprised, I turned right around and asked my mother about the call. Judith answered with seamless, casual indifference. "Oh, Mallory told me this morning that she feels uncomfortable having an outsider in the house, while Hazel is still so vulnerable to seasonal germs. She was worried about outside bacteria and asked if we could postpone Janelle's start date by a week or 2. I frowned, turning toward the stairs to confirm with Mallory. At that exact second, Hazel let out a sharp cry from the nursery. Mallory was bustling around the changing table, trying to soothe the baby. Before I could walk up the steps, Judith called out from the foyer. "She just told me about it this morning, Garrett. Why are you cross-examining everyone? You are going to miss your flight." I caught Mallory's eye from across the room. There was a flicker of confusion in her tired expression, but Hazel was wailing frantically, and Mallory simply patted the baby's back and called out, "Hurry to the airport, honey, or you will hit highway traffic. We will manage everything here." That was the very first red flag I carelessly overlooked. The first day on site in Columbus went smoothly. During my evening break, I initiated a video call. Mallory was propped up in bed, cradling Hazel, looking tired but offering a reassuring smile. While we were talking, Judith walked into the room carrying a hot bowl of chicken noodle soup, placed it gently on the nightstand, and reminded Mallory to eat before it cooled. Watching that interaction through the screen, I breathed a sigh of relief, convinced that my pre-trip anxieties had been entirely unfounded. By the second day, the engineering crisis on the factory floor escalated significantly. I was working 16-hour shifts, catching quick phone calls only during brief lunch breaks. It was on that second evening that Judith began pressuring Mallory to put her smartphone away. She insisted that prolonged screen exposure strained the optic nerves of postpartum women, caused chronic migraines, and that cellular electromagnetic frequencies were hazardous near an infant's developing brain. Mallory was skeptical of the pseudoscience, but between nursing around the clock and severe surgical fatigue, she gradually stopped checking her phone as frequently. On the morning of the third day, Judith demanded that Mallory hand over the smartphone entirely so she could lock it away for the remainder of the postpartum recovery month. Mallory objected immediately, stating that she needed her device to stay in contact with me and her parents in Malvern. Judith's tone hardened instantly. She insisted that incoming notifications were disrupting Mallory's sleep and that any urgent family matters could easily be relayed through her. When Mallory still refused to surrender her personal property, Judith dropped a chilling remark. "Your husband entrusted the two of you to my care. Submitting to the authority of this household for one single month is not going to kill you." Exhausted, isolated, and desperate to avoid a toxic household confrontation while holding a crying newborn, Mallory did not know how to de-escalate the situation. She had no idea that once her phone was locked inside the master bedroom vanity drawer, a string of fabricated, affectionate text messages would continue to be sent to my number every single day. And hundreds of miles away in a noisy manufacturing facility, I fully believed I was texting my wife. During those initial few days, my mother maintained a facade of care, partly because I called it unpredictable hours, and partly because Hazel was so small that Judith still wanted to project the image of a devoted matriarch. Through the screen, I saw my wife resting in a tidy room, the baby sleeping peacefully, and my mother bustling in with bowls of soup or glasses of warm milk. I had no way of knowing that this performative care would vanish the moment my work schedule shifted into overnight testing. About a week into the assignment, our engineering team began overnight stress testing on the conveyor systems. We were stationed on the plant floor from 5 in the afternoon until 2 in the morning. My communication windows became erratic. Some days, I could only manage a quick text before crashing into an exhausted sleep at the hotel. That communication blackout provided the exact opportunity Judith had been waiting for. The very next morning, Judith cooked a hot breakfast downstairs but did not bring a tray up to the bedroom. Instead, she stood at the bottom of the staircase and shouted that food was on the stove, and if Mallory was hungry, she could come down and get it herself. Mallory's surgical incision was still inflamed and acutely painful. Descending the carpeted stairs required gripping the railing with both hands. Hazel had just nursed and fallen asleep against her chest. Setting the baby down in the bassinet would immediately trigger another screaming fit. Mallory called down, asking politely if Judith could bring a single plate of food upstairs. My mother did not budge. She looked up the stairwell with a cold, disgusted expression and replied, "You had a standard delivery, Mallory. You are not paralyzed. Walking a few stairs will actually speed up your recovery." Mallory chose not to escalate. She waited nearly an hour until Hazel was in a deep sleep, gently transferred her to the crib, and slowly dragged herself down to the kitchen. By the time she reached the stove, the eggs were congealed and cold, and the skillet had already been set in the sink to soak. Had that been an isolated incident, Mallory might have attributed it to an older woman's blunt demeanor. But the following day, the hostility escalated into deliberate, calculated neglect. That morning, Judith dressed up to attend a senior wellness class and a brunch with her local social circle. She told Mallory she would be gone for 45 minutes, but she did not return until nearly 1 in the afternoon. Upstairs, Mallory had only 2 dry slices of sandwich bread and half a carton of almond milk. When Hazel began crying relentlessly from colic, Mallory was physically unable to leave the nursery to prepare food. She remembered her phone, wanting desperately to call me or her mother, but the device remained locked in the vanity drawer. When Judith finally walked through the front door carrying shopping bags, Mallory went downstairs and requested her phone back. Judith flatly refused, snapping, "Garrett is managing a multi-million-dollar industrial contract. You are going to distract him over petty domestic chores so he ruins his career?" Mallory swallowed her pride and asked if Judith could at least place a call to her mother, Colleen, so she could come over to help. Judith's face instantly twisted. "If your parents find out you cannot handle a routine postpartum recovery, they will assume I am mistreating you, which will create bad blood between our families." Mallory finally recognized that confiscating her phone had nothing to do with health or medical lore. She stood her ground, stating clearly that it was her personal property, and she had every legal right to contact her husband and parents. It was then that my mother unveiled her true, unfiltered worldview. She looked Mallory up and down with absolute contempt. When a woman marries into a family, she learns the hierarchy of that family. If I do not teach you proper humility right now, you will think you run this entire house. From that third day onward, meals became my mother's primary weapon of psychological subjugation. Judith continued to cook regular meals, but she never set aside a portion for Mallory. Whenever Mallory managed to soothe the baby and make it downstairs, the prime entrees had already been packed into sealed containers. The refrigerator remained stocked with chicken, beef, eggs, and produce, but Judith had explicitly labeled them with blue painter's tape, warning that they were reserved for her own upcoming meals and must not be touched. A woman recovering from major surgery inside her own home was forced to stand before a fully stocked refrigerator, terrified to touch a single ingredient without being accused of theft or disrespect. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, my phone regularly received pleasant updates from Mallory's number. Mom made a lovely beef stew today. Hazel is sleeping much better. Do not worry about us. Focus on your work. The text style felt somewhat terser than usual, prompting me to ask once, "Are you feeling exhausted, honey?" The reply was swift. "Yes, just a bit sleepy from nursing." I believed every word. On one rare evening when our engineering team finished testing early, I attempted an unscheduled video call to Mallory's phone. The call rang out unanswered. A few minutes later, a text popped up. "Hazel is nursing right now. I will call you later." Shortly after, my mother initiated a video call from her own phone. She angled the camera exclusively on Hazel, sleeping peacefully in her nursery bassinet, casually mentioning that Mallory had just stepped into the shower. I chuckled, asking how she managed to stay so energetic while watching the baby. Judith sighed with practiced martyrdom. "Oh, Garrett. Caring for a postpartum mother is twice as exhausting as raising a newborn of your own." Not only did she manipulate me, but she also carefully cultivated a saintly reputation among our extended family. In our extended family group chat, Judith posted a high-resolution photo of a gourmet bowl of butternut squash soup next to a plate of roasted vegetables, writing, "Preparing fresh, nutrient-rich meals every single day for my daughter-in-law to ensure my sweet granddaughter has plenty of milk." Aunts and cousins chimed in with effusive praise, declaring how blessed Mallory was to have such an extraordinarily selfless mother-in-law. I later discovered that the gourmet meal in the photograph was cooked entirely for Judith herself. She had plated it beautifully, snapped the photograph for social validation, and consumed it down to the last bite. Mallory had eaten stale pita bread and a hard-boiled egg that day. By the fourth day of severe caloric deficit and physical exhaustion, Mallory's breast milk supply plummeted. Hazel, unable to nurse adequately, wailed inconsolably throughout the night. Hearing the baby cry, Judith marched into the bedroom, not with empathy, but with harsh scolding, blaming Mallory's irregular eating habits for failing to produce enough milk. For the first time after days of silent endurance, Mallory pushed back, her voice shaking. "I want to eat nutritious food, Judith. But you deliberately lock everything away and never leave a single portion for me." That direct confrontation sent Judith into a rage. She felt her authority challenged and fired back. "I am the mother of this house, not your hired domestic servant. Am I supposed to wait on you hand and foot?" Mallory was too physically depleted to engage in a screaming match. She whispered with quiet resolve, "I never asked you to wait on me. I am simply asking you to unlock the vanity and return my phone so I can call my husband." Judith did not yield. She kept the key firmly in her pocket and stated cold-bloodedly, "When Garrett returns home next week, we will sit down as an entire family and address your insolence once and for all." By the fifth day, Mallory reached the absolute brink of physical collapse. Hazel had cried almost uninterruptedly through the night, while Mallory had consumed nothing since the previous evening, aside from a single glass of almond milk and 3 dry crackers. That morning, unable to wait for Judith to return from her morning errands, Mallory attempted to make it down to the kitchen to boil some eggs. Halfway down the stairs, her vision suddenly went completely black. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the carpeted steps, sliding down 2 steps before catching herself against the wooden spindles, leaning her head against the drywall for nearly 20 minutes until the room stopped spinning. What terrified her most in that moment was not her own fainting spell. Looking up the stairwell toward the bedroom where Hazel lay, Mallory was paralyzed by a horrifying realization. If she had been carrying our newborn daughter in her arms when her body gave out, Hazel could have tumbled down the entire flight of stairs. It was on that very same morning in Ohio that our engineering team decided to work through the night to complete the final diagnostic run. By dawn, the entire automated sorting facility passed all stress tests with zero communication errors. The client signed the acceptance paperwork a full week ahead of schedule, and my manager told me I could return home immediately instead of staying through the third week. I pulled out my phone to dial Mallory. The line rang for a few seconds before I hung up. I wanted to surprise her. I wanted to see the pure joy on her face when I walked through the front door unannounced. A few minutes later, another text arrived from Mallory's phone. "Everything is completely fine at home. Focus on your project. Do not worry." I smiled warmly as I read it, completely unaware that my mother believed she still had a full 7 days to maintain her house of cards. She had no idea that I was already boarding a morning flight back to Philadelphia, and that within a few short hours, I would witness the horrifying reality she had so meticulously concealed. After hearing my mother shout that she was not a maid, I refused to waste another second arguing. There are moments when engaging in a shouting match only drags the crisis into a debate over semantics, while the true priority stands suffering right in front of your eyes. Mallory had undergone major abdominal surgery less than 3 weeks prior. Her body was gaunt and trembling, and Hazel's voice was hoarse from days of maternal distress and inadequate nourishment. I turned on my heel, walked straight up the stairs, pulled a canvas duffel bag from the master closet, and began rapidly packing clothes and essentials for my wife and daughter. Mallory followed me into the room, her expression a mixture of profound exhaustion and mounting anxiety. She caught my wrist, her voice trembling as she urged me not to escalate things further, saying she had only wanted me home so I would understand what had happened, never expecting me to immediately pack their bags and pull them out of the house. Looking into her pale, bloodless face, I realized she was still terrified of being blamed for causing a rift between my mother and me. "Mallory," I said gently, looking into her eyes, "this became a crisis the second you were starved inside your own home. It did not magically become a crisis just because I caught her doing it. I packed only the absolute necessities: Mallory's comfortable clothes, Hazel's onesies, diapers, pediatric discharge papers, postpartum medications, and the infant car seat. I had zero desire to create a theatrical spectacle of packing up our entire life in a fit of rage. My sole, urgent objective was to get my wife and daughter out of that hostile environment immediately, ensure Mallory had a warm, nourishing meal and a safe place to rest, and deal with the remaining fallout afterward." My mother stormed up the stairs behind us, her initial defiance quickly morphing into bitter accusations. She claimed that I had just walked through the door and, after hearing only one side of the story, was already treating my own mother like a villain. According to her narrative, there had never been a shortage of food in the house. Mallory was simply spoiled and overly sensitive, using her surgery as an excuse to act lazy and demand room service. Without uttering a word of debate, I walked past her, descended to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out every single meal prep container marked with blue painter's tape, placing them side by side on the quartz island. "Judith's dinner. Do not touch. Save for tomorrow." I looked at my mother and asked, "If your intention was genuinely for Mallory to prepare her own meals, why is nearly every single cooked dish in this refrigerator explicitly labeled with warnings forbidding her to touch it?" Judith flinched slightly, but quickly recovered her defense, arguing that she was merely portioning meals for household efficiency. If she wanted something, all she had to do was ask. Nobody forbade her from asking. That self-serving justification shattered what little restraint I had left. Does a woman recovering from major abdominal surgery have to beg for your formal permission just to fry an egg in her own home? My voice was not raised, but the sheer coldness in my tone filled the kitchen. I told her plainly that if she had been unwilling or unable to care for Mallory, all she had to do was tell me before I boarded my flight to Ohio. I would have gladly driven Mallory to her parents' home in Malvern or ensured Janelle came every morning. What was utterly unforgivable was that she had actively blocked my wife from leaving, confiscated her phone, canceled our paid postpartum doula, and turned the basic human necessity of eating a hot meal into an exercise in psychological degradation. Cornered, Judith immediately pivoted to blaming Mallory, claiming my wife was a manipulative drama queen who had deliberately orchestrated this moment to turn her son against her. As Mallory began to stammer an apology, I stepped firmly in front of her. "Mom, stop. Mallory does not need to say another word. I have eyes of my own." I saw my wife unable to stand without collapsing. I saw the dry, congealed bowl of oatmeal by her bed. I saw her phone locked inside the vanity drawer, and I see these labeled food containers right here on the counter. Once a person sees reality with their own eyes, you cannot gaslight them into unseeing it. I gently secured Hazel in her infant car seat and began carrying her toward the front door, while Mallory leaned on my other arm. As we reached the foyer, my mother suddenly stepped forward, physically blocking the entryway. She glared at the car seat in my hand and uttered a sentence that made me wonder if I was looking at a complete stranger. "If your wife wants to walk out of this house, she can walk out. But my granddaughter stays right here." I froze. Up until that exact second, I had rationalized my mother's actions as extreme generational stubbornness and petty domestic insecurity. But that single demand laid bare her twisted entitlement. In her mind, Mallory was merely an expendable vessel to be discarded, while Hazel was an institutional trophy belonging exclusively to our family line. I pulled Hazel's car seat closer to my side and spoke with chilling clarity. "Hazel is the daughter of Mallory and me. She is not a piece of family real estate. Wherever her mother goes, our daughter goes with her." Judith refused to move. She threatened that if I walked out that door with the baby, she would immediately call every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our family to bear witness that her daughter-in-law had taken the baby and torn the family apart, challenging me to see who would have any dignity left in the community. In the past, the mere mention of family reputation and extended relatives would have caused me to back down and seek a polite compromise. But at that moment, looking at Mallory's hollow cheeks and hearing Hazel's raspy breaths, social appearances meant absolutely nothing to me. I looked directly at my mother and said, "You can call every single relative in your phone book, Mom. But before you dial a single number, understand this. I am driving Mallory straight to the obstetric clinic to be examined by her surgical team, and I will report every detail of the past 5 days of deliberate neglect on her medical record. If the medical staff documents that she is severely dehydrated, malnourished, and clinically exhausted, you will be the one explaining to the entire family why a postpartum surgical patient was starved under your roof." Judith stared at me, the color draining completely from her face. For several seconds, she could not utter a sound. She realized, with sudden terror, that I was no longer an obedient son navigating her emotional demands. I was standing before her as a husband and a father, fiercely protecting his family. Less than 45 minutes later, Mallory's parents pulled into the driveway in their sport utility vehicle. Douglas entered the house without shouting or making a scene. He simply looked at his daughter from head to toe and asked gently, "Can you walk to the car, sweetheart?" Mallory nodded, but as she took 2 unsteady steps, Colleen had to turn her head away to wipe a tear when she saw her daughter gripping the hallway console table just to stay upright. Colleen turned to Judith and spoke a single, quiet sentence. "If caring for a healing mother feels like being a maid to you, Judith, then please step aside and let me take care of my own daughter." Her voice was entirely devoid of malice, yet that dignified restraint rendered the entire living room dead silent. My mother looked away, unable to meet her gaze, while Mallory bit her lip to hold back tears. Before walking out, I demanded the key to the vanity drawer. Judith threw the small brass key onto the entryway table with a venomous sneer. "Once you walk out that door, do not ever think about coming back when things get difficult." I retrieved Mallory's phone, slipped it into her purse, and looked back at my mother one last time. "I am not afraid of difficult times, Mom. What terrifies me is the thought of knowing my wife was being abused and pretending I never saw it." I helped Mallory into the back seat of Douglas's vehicle, secured Hazel's base, and loaded our duffel bag into the trunk. As the vehicle pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the side mirror. Judith was standing alone on the front porch, watching us drive away. For over 30 years, whenever my mother was displeased, I was always the one who circled back to apologize and smooth things over. This time, I did not turn around. We did not drive straight to Malvern. Looking at Mallory's shallow breathing and limp posture in the back seat, an overwhelming sense of dread compelled me to act immediately. I asked Douglas to divert the car straight to the outpatient obstetrics and pediatric clinic affiliated with Chester County Hospital, where Hazel was born. Douglas nodded without hesitation, while Colleen sat beside Mallory, gently dabbing the cold sweat from her daughter's forehead with a damp cloth. The clinical evaluation was thorough and sobering. The obstetrician examined Mallory's abdominal incision, monitored her dangerously low blood pressure, and assessed her nutritional status and lactation levels. While the surgical incision showed no acute internal infection, The medical summary was devastating. Severe maternal physical exhaustion, acute nutritional deficit, secondary dehydration, and significant lactation depletion, resulting from prolonged caloric restriction and systemic stress. The pediatrician weighed Hazel, confirming that our newborn daughter had dropped below her standard postpartum weight curve, not yet in critical danger, but requiring strict feeding, monitoring, and supplemental formula to recover. The clinical staff provided strict medical directives: high-protein, nutrient-dense meals around the clock, aggressive oral hydration, uninterrupted blocks of rest, and dedicated support for infant care to prevent maternal collapse. Those instructions sounded basic and elementary, yet standing in that sterile exam room, each word felt like a boulder crushing my chest. Watching Mallory through the observation window, cradling Hazel with cold, trembling hands, my anger toward my mother was swallowed by an agonizing wave of personal guilt. I had arrogantly assumed that I had arranged everything perfectly before leaving for Ohio. I had bought groceries, hired an in-home doula, and left funds. Yet in the end, the two people who paid the horrifying price for my naive trust were my wife and my newborn daughter. When we were finally left alone in the recovery cubicle, I took Mallory's cold hand and choked back tears, apologizing repeatedly. I told her that had I known this would happen, I would have resigned from the engineering firm on the spot rather than leaving for Ohio. Mallory remained silent for a long moment, then softly shook her head. She was not bitter about my business trip. What had broken her spirit was something far deeper. "Garrett," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What broke my heart was not that you had to travel. What broke me was that every time I desperately tried to call you, I could never reach you." I looked at her in shock. For 2 weeks, I had believed she never called because she was too exhausted and preferred texting. Mallory explained that on at least 2 occasions, she had seized a fleeting moment while Judith was in the shower or downstairs to retrieve her phone from the vanity and dial my number. But before the call could connect, Judith had caught her, physically snatching the phone from her hands while berating her. "Your husband is on an industrial job site. Stop harassing him with your domestic whinings." I immediately pulled Mallory's phone from her purse to inspect the device settings. The recent call logs showed no outgoing calls. They had been systematically cleared. More disturbingly, upon opening the notification preferences, I discovered that my contact profile, along with Colleen's, had been placed on total silent mode, with all incoming call banners and ringtones disabled. There was no longer any room for naive rationalization. Confiscating a phone could not be excused as an eccentric, old-fashioned postpartum belief. These deliberate setting alterations proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Judith had intentionally severed Mallory's communication lifeline to isolate her completely. I did not share these technical details with Mallory to avoid causing her further emotional trauma. Instead, I gently asked, "Mallory, do you remember the text from Janelle, the doula, before I left?" Mallory nodded immediately. She explained that from the day I left, she had assumed my mother simply disliked outside help and had temporarily delayed Janelle's start date, but she herself had never requested the cancellation. In fact, on the very afternoon of my departure, Mallory had intended to tell me how much she needed Janelle's help because of her surgical limitations. That evening, after settling Mallory and Hazel into the peaceful ground floor guest suite at my in-laws' house in Malvern, I stepped out onto the back deck and dialed Janelle's phone number. Before I could even finish my question, Janelle expressed genuine astonishment. She explained that she had assumed Mallory and I had mutually decided against hiring postpartum support. According to Janelle, Judith had called her on the exact morning of my flight, stating unequivocally that her daughter-in-law was extremely particular, disliked having strangers touch the newborn, and that the family had decided to manage everything internally. Janelle added that Judith had demanded a full refund of the advance deposit I had previously paid. Crucially, Judith had instructed Janelle not to wire the refund back to my original checking account, but instead provided her own personal electronic transfer details. I verified the dates and times, opening my mobile banking application. Everything aligned with sickening precision. The deposit funds had been transferred into Judith's personal account the very day after I left for Ohio, and she had never mentioned a single word of it to me. A painful memory flashed through my mind. On the afternoon I was loading my luggage into the trunk, Janelle had texted to ask about the schedule change. When I asked Judith about it, she had smoothly lied, claiming Mallory did not want outside germs near the baby. And when Hazel began crying in the background, Judith had chimed in to speak on Mallory's behalf, assuring me that Mallory had discussed it with her that morning. Back then, I had chosen to believe my mother simply because it was the most convenient, frictionless path for me. Janelle hesitated on the phone before adding one final detail. Garrett, before your mother hung up that morning, she said something that made me feel deeply unsettled. She told me, if a young woman is pampered too much after giving birth, she will become impossible to control later on. At the time, I thought it was just an old-fashioned opinion. I had no idea things would turn out like this. I sat in absolute silence long after the call ended. I could no longer comfort myself with the illusion that my mother had acted out of momentary frustration or simple generational ignorance. The cancellation of our postpartum doula had been orchestrated before I even left the driveway. It meant that Judith had intentionally engineered an environment of total isolation to force Mallory into absolute, humiliating dependency. I meticulously took screenshots of the call logs, text records, and electronic bank refund transfers. I also politely requested that Janelle preserve all communication records on her phone. I was not collecting evidence out of a desire for vengeance. Rather, after everything that had transpired, I needed the indisputable truth. I refused to ever again blindly trust someone out of sentimentality while forcing the innocent party to suffer in silence. Late that night, Douglas walked through the living room and found me sitting alone in the dark. He laid a soft wool throw blanket over the back of the sofa and spoke in his quiet, measured tone. Garrett, you do not owe me an apology. What matters right now is showing Mallory that during the most vulnerable chapter of her life, her husband will never abandon her to stand alone again. I could only manage a choked, heartfelt nod. Afterward, I walked into the guest room to assist Mallory with Hazel's night feeding. I fumbled clumsily with the newborn diaper tabs, sticking them crookedly twice before finally getting it right. Exhausted as she was, Mallory let out a quiet, genuine laugh. It was the first time I had seen her smile since returning from Ohio, a tiny, fragile moment of lightness that lifted the suffocating weight in the room. Sitting beside Hazel's bassinet for over an hour, listening to the synchronized breathing of my wife and daughter, I felt for the first time that our small family was finally standing on the same side of the line. That fragile peace was shattered the following morning. Just as I finished pouring a cup of warm bone broth for Mallory in the kitchen, my phone on the counter began vibrating relentlessly. The first incoming call was from my paternal aunt, followed immediately by an uncle, a cousin, and several extended family members. Within less than 30 minutes, it became glaringly apparent that Judith had not remained idle after our departure. Overnight, the narrative circulating among our extended family had been completely inverted into an unrecognizable work of fiction. When I answered my aunt's call, she launched into an immediate, breathless scolding, claiming that my mother had spent 2 agonizing weeks sacrificing her health, waking before dawn to care for the baby, only for Mallory to show utter ingratitude and manipulate me into pulling the newborn away to her parents' house the second I landed. "Your mother is in her 60s, Garrett," my aunt exclaimed indignantly. "She was waiting on your wife hand and foot, carrying hot meals up the stairs, and Mallory has the audacity to create a family scandal? And you are enabling this disrespect against your own mother?" I listened, feeling an overwhelming blend of fury and profound helplessness. In Judith's fabricated retelling, Mallory was not a neglected surgical patient whose communications had been severed. She was portrayed as a pampered, entitled daughter-in-law who had received 5-star treatment and still staged a dramatic walkout to humiliate her mother-in-law. The staged photographs of nutritious soups and lactation drinks that Judith had posted in the family group chat were now being weaponized as conclusive proof of her saintly dedication. Following my aunt, another uncle and several cousins called in rapid succession. Some inquired with guarded concern, others openly lectured me on filial duty and family honor. I refused to litigate the dispute across multiple phone calls, giving each of them the exact same composed response. "I will address this matter once, in person, when the entire family is gathered. I will not engage in fragmented debates over the telephone." I knew full well that if I lost my temper and began venting piecemeal details over the phone, the facts would be distorted through the family grapevine, worsening the chaos. Around 11 in the morning, a text message arrived from Judith. "I spent over 30 years dedicating my life to raising you, only to lose my son to a woman you have been married to for less than 7 years. I stared at the screen, reading those words repeatedly before setting the phone face down on the counter. In the past, that specific brand of emotional manipulation would have instantly triggered a wave of guilt, driving me to apologize and concede whatever she demanded just to alleviate her distress. But this time, the image of Mallory sitting propped against the headboard with bloodless, cracked lips and hollow cheeks burned in my mind. I knew that replying in anger would result in words that could never be retracted, so I chose deliberate silence. Mallory, noticing that I had been standing on the back deck for a long time, stepped outside wrapped in a cardigan. Her color had improved slightly, though she was still fragile. Seeing my silenced phone, she assumed I was caught in an agonizing emotional dilemma and offered gently, "Garrett, if you feel you need to visit your mother to check on her, please go. I will not stand in your way." I looked at my wife and stated with complete clarity, "Mallory, I will always be my mother's son. But I am also your husband, and I am Hazel's father. Those three roles must coexist with integrity. One role is never permitted to crush the others." Mallory did not say another word. She squeezed my hand and returned inside to Hazel. At that moment, I understood that shielding my wife did not mean turning my mother into an enemy, but filial duty could never be used as a moral justification to demand that my wife endure abuse simply to keep my mother comfortable. Early that afternoon, my younger sister, Brooke, arrived unexpectedly at my in-laws' house. Brooke had always been exceptionally close to our mother, habitually taking her side in every household dispute. When she walked through the door, I braced myself for an inevitable confrontation. Yet Brooke did not yell. She walked into the living room, looked at Mallory for a long, silent moment, and asked in a hushed tone, "Mallory, is it really true that you did not have a single hot meal for 5 straight days?" Mallory recounted the events calmly and factually. The confiscated phone, the locked food containers, the canceled doula, and the days she had survived on crackers and almond milk because she was physically unable to descend the stairs while nursing a colicky newborn. Mallory did not bring up past grievances, nor did she embellish her account with emotional hyperbole. That quiet, objective retelling made the reality far more shocking for Brooke. Brooke pulled out her own smartphone and showed us her message history. Throughout the 2 weeks I was in Ohio, Judith had sent Brooke a steady stream of photos, steaming bowls of gourmet soup, platters of roast chicken, and sweet snapshots of Hazel sleeping, accompanied by complaints about how exhausting it was to wait on a postpartum daughter-in-law. Brooke admitted she had fully believed our mother, even texting back to advise Judith not to overexert herself. Then, Brooke scrolled back to an older message thread dated a few days before I departed for Ohio. Judith had texted her, "This time, I am going to teach Mallory a lesson about who holds the authority in this household. If I do not establish the boundaries now, she will walk all over me." Reading those words on the screen made the blood in my veins run cold. That single message did not detail every operational tactic, but it conclusively proved premeditation. The systematic subjugation of Mallory had been planned well before I boarded my flight. This was never a spontaneous breakdown of patience during the final 5 days. It was a deliberate campaign of dominance. Brooke sat in silence for a long time before confessing to another hidden detail that had fueled our mother's resentment. About a month prior to Hazel's birth, Brooke's boutique clothing shop in downtown Westchester had faced severe cash flow issues after she over-leveraged on seasonal inventory. Judith had approached Mallory privately, pressuring her to lend Brooke $18,000 from our joint emergency savings. That fund had been specifically earmarked for hospital delivery copays, nursery furnishings, several months of Mallory's unpaid maternity leave, and unexpected newborn medical costs. Mallory had declined the loan, and when she discussed it with me, I fully supported her decision. I had explained to my mother that an emergency maternity reserve could not be gambled on retail inventory right before a high-risk cesarean section delivery. Brooke herself had told our mother to drop the request, insisting she would resolve her business debts independently. Yet Judith had harbored that refusal as an unforgivable personal insult. Brooke looked down, her voice breaking with shame. "Mom genuinely believed that Mallory was hoarding family funds and turning you against your own sister." Brooke turned to Mallory with tears in her eyes. "Mallory, I am so deeply sorry. I never, ever wanted my financial struggles to be weaponized as an excuse for Mom to mistreat you." Mallory immediately shook her head. "Brooke, accountability belongs to the person who committed the act. You cannot be blamed for your mother's wrongful choices." I placed a hand on Brooke's shoulder. "I do not hold any resentment toward you, Brooke. Mom must take responsibility for her own actions. We will not let this tear our sibling relationship apart. That was my absolute priority." I refused to let a toxic dispute between my mother and my wife mutate into an all-out civil war between siblings and extended families. If there was any wisdom to be salvaged from this painful ordeal, it was the clarity to distinguish the wrongdoer from the innocent family members caught in her orbit. Yet my mother had no intention of adopting such maturity. While the three of us were talking in the living room, the gravel in the driveway crunched under tires. Looking out the front window, I saw Judith stepping out of a crossover sport utility vehicle, accompanied by two of our paternal aunts. In her hands, my mother carried a large nursery gift bag, packed with infant clothes, swaddles, and several cans of baby formula. She walked straight up the front walkway, completely bypassing any courteous inquiry about Mallory's health. She marched directly into the foyer, her eyes zeroing in on the nursery hallway, and announced in a booming, unyielding voice that stunned everyone present, "I have come to bring my granddaughter back to her rightful home." Judith stood in the entryway of my in-laws' home with an expression so unyielding that it was immediately apparent she had not come to engage in a rational dialogue. The two aunts accompanying her glanced around nervously, offering vague platitudes about how family disputes should be resolved privately behind closed doors. But the fact that they stood on either side of my mother, flanking the massive nursery bag she carried, made it clear that Judith had come with the absolute expectation of taking Hazel back by sheer force of will. As Colleen carried Hazel out of the nursery to soothe her, my mother took an aggressive step forward. She did not ask how Mallory was healing. She did not ask if Hazel was feeding properly. She simply demanded, "I am here to take my granddaughter home today." Before I could even intervene, Judith added with icy authority, "Mallory can stay with her parents for as long as she pleases. But Hazel carries our family name, and she will not be kept in a maternal household indefinitely, as if her father's family does not exist." Douglas maintained extraordinary composure. He motioned for Judith to take a seat in the living room, offering a glass of water, and asked a simple, fundamental question. "Judith, the baby is exclusively breastfeeding. If you take the newborn without her mother, how exactly do you propose to nourish her?" Judith answered without missing a beat. "If maternal milk is unavailable, we will use formula. Modern pediatric science has countless alternatives. I raised 2 healthy children to adulthood. I do not need anyone instructing me on infant nutrition." Mallory, standing by the hallway archway, went pale. Looking at my wife, I understood that her terror stemmed not merely from Judith's desire to see the baby, but from the chilling realization that my mother was entirely willing to tear a 3-week-old infant away from her biological mother simply to establish custody and ownership. I stepped directly into the center of the room, speaking with absolute finality. "Hazel is not going anywhere without Mallory's explicit consent. And let me make one thing crystal clear. Even as her father, I have zero legal or moral authority to separate an infant from her mother, especially when they need each other to heal." One of the aunts immediately clicked her tongue, muttering, "Garrett, you have become utterly submissive to your wife. You cannot make a single decision without her permission." I did not lose my temper. I looked my aunt in the eye and replied calmly, "Respecting the mother of my child is not being submissive. It is being a responsible man." My aunt fell silent, but Judith's fury exploded. She accused me of being thoroughly brainwashed by my in-laws, claiming that in my eyes, the woman who had given me life was now worth less than my wife. She declared that if I continued down this path, she would disown me as her son. In the past, that ultimate ultimatum would have brought me to my knees in an effort to appease her. But this time, having witnessed the devastating real-world consequences of unprincipled appeasement, I knew I could no longer weaponize the concept of filial devotion to subject my wife to further abuse. Brooke, who had been standing silently near the dining room door, stepped forward. Without a word, she unlocked her smartphone, pulled up the text message our mother had sent before my Ohio trip, and held the screen directly in front of Judith's face. "This time, I am going to teach Mallory a lesson about who holds the authority in this household." Judith's face shifted through shock and panic, but she quickly attempted to deflect. "That was just a venting remark in a moment of frustration. Families say exaggerated things when they are annoyed. Does a single text prove I intentionally starved anyone?" I did not engage in verbal sparring. I unlocked my phone, displayed the detailed text conversation with Janelle, and placed the electronic banking record on the coffee table, showing the exact refund transaction transferred into Judith's personal account the morning I departed. Confronted with undeniable financial and digital evidence, Judith could no longer deny that she had systematically dismissed the doula. She immediately shifted her defense, claiming that outside help was financially wasteful and that she had merely acted to save our household money. I looked directly at my mother. If your sole motivation was saving our household money, why did you hide it from me? Why did you tell me that Mallory wanted to cancel, while telling Janelle that Mallory and I had mutually changed our minds? The living room fell into total, suffocating silence. The two aunts who had arrived as Judith's vocal advocates exchanged uneasy glances, unable to offer a single word of defense. One aunt finally sighed, looking down at the carpet. "Judith, you may have had reservations about outside help, but orchestrating two completely conflicting stories is indefensible." Seeing her own relatives withdraw their unconditional support, Judith completely lost her composure. She turned her fury directly upon Mallory, screaming that all of this turmoil was Mallory's fault for being selfish and withholding, refusing to lend family money to Brooke when her boutique was in distress. According to Judith, from the moment Mallory entered our home, she had systematically alienated me from my mother and sister. Mallory had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but at that moment, she spoke with steady, unbreakable dignity. "Judith, that $18,000 was our designated maternity medical fund to ensure our child's safe delivery and cover my unpaid leave. Choosing to protect my immediate family's health does not mean I owe a debt to anyone. I will gladly help family when possible, but protecting the funds required to birth and nourish my child is a fundamental right that belongs to our marriage." Judith was so incensed that she shot up from the sofa, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Mallory's face. I stepped forward instantly, placing my body directly between them. I did not touch my mother, nor did I raise my voice, but my tone was cold and unyielding. "Mom, if you want to lecture someone, lecture me. Do not ever stand inside another family's home and point your finger at my wife." Judith stared at me for several agonizing seconds, her eyes welling with tears of humiliated rage. She wailed that she had sacrificed over 30 years of her life raising her son, only to be publicly opposed in front of her in-laws. In years past, those maternal tears would have melted my resolve instantly. But looking at her then, I felt only profound sorrow. I loved my mother, but I could not allow that love to rewrite reality and erase the cruelty she had inflicted upon Mallory. Judith wiped her tears aggressively, grabbed the nursery gift bag, and snarled, "Fine. From this day forward, consider yourself without a mother." She stormed out of the house, shouting from the driveway that she would ensure the entire community knew her daughter-in-law had torn our family apart. I did not chase after her. I stood in the doorway, watching her vehicle speed down the street, until it disappeared past the neighborhood bend. The house remained quiet for a long time. Mallory sat back down on the sofa, her hands intertwined in her lap, and asked in a whisper if I regretted taking such an absolute stance against my mother. I knelt beside her and said, "Mallory, I am not picking a side between my mother and my wife. I am choosing right over wrong. If the roles were reversed and you had inflicted this kind of harm on my mother, I would hold you to the exact same standard." Douglas gave an approving nod from across the room. Colleen did not speak another word about the confrontation. She simply walked into the kitchen to warm up a fresh bowl of chicken soup for her daughter, using calm, domestic normalcy to help the household transition past the conflict. That quiet, dignified restraint demonstrated what true maturity looked like. A healthy family does not require one party to conquer another. It requires every member to know where their boundaries end. I assumed the crisis had reached a temporary pause, but late that evening, Brooke called my phone in sheer panic. "Garrett, Mom has locked herself in her bedroom, refusing to eat. She is threatening to put the family house on the market and move out of state because her children have supposedly abandoned her." I listened to Brooke's frantic breathing and heavy silence. Regardless of my anger, I could not completely ignore the woman who raised me when she made such alarming, dramatic threats. I told Mallory to remain safely in Malvern with Hazel, while I drove back to the suburban family home to speak with Judith alone, not to bring my wife and child back into harm's way, but to establish once and for all that while filial love remained, her emotional manipulation, theatrical threats, and weaponization of social shame had to cease permanently. The following evening, I drove alone to the two-story house I had lived in for over 30 years. Before I left Malvern, Mallory simply reminded me not to speak out of blind fury in ways I might later regret. She never demanded that I sever ties with my mother, nor did she attempt to stop me from checking on her well-being. Her quiet grace only reinforced how deeply mistaken my mother was to believe Mallory wanted to steal me away. The front door was unlocked. Walking into the living room, the chandelier was brightly lit. Judith was sitting upright on the sofa, dressed impeccably in slacks and a cardigan, surrounded by organized stacks of old household financial ledgers, property tax receipts, and utility records. Seeing her composed posture, I realized immediately that Brooke's panicked report of our mother locking herself away and starving in despair was merely theatrical hyperbole intended to force my submission. Judith was in complete control of herself. She did not ask how Hazel or Mallory were doing. She pushed the paperwork aside and stated coldly, "I have thought about this all night, Garrett. If you still consider this your home, you will bring your wife and daughter back here tomorrow. If you insist on moving out to please your wife, then leave completely and permanently. Do not pretend you can be an honorable son while pandering to her every whim." I waited for her to finish before replying with measured composure. "Mom, I have already made my decision. I am signing a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment for Mallory, Hazel, and myself, at least for the duration of her recovery, and until clear boundaries are established in this family. I am not abandoning you, nor am I forcing you out of this house, but I will never permit my wife to live under conditions of neglect again." Judith's fury reignited instantly. She gestured wildly around the spacious living room, demanding why I would waste money leasing an apartment when we owned a 2-story home, all because of my wife's complaints. "You are taking family money and handing it to an outside landlord just to indulge a woman who entered this family only a few years ago." I looked her in the eyes and said firmly, "I would rather pay rent for a modest apartment where my family is safe than live in a massive house where my wife is forced to beg for permission just to eat a meal." For the first time, I laid out the unvarnished truth. I had never expected her to wait on Mallory hand and foot. If she had felt overwhelmed, all she had to do was communicate openly, and we would have moved to Malvern or kept Janelle on schedule. Instead, she had actively engineered an environment of extreme isolation, sabotaged our paid help, confiscated Mallory's phone, and exploited Mallory's physical vulnerability to manufacture an image of her as lazy and entitled. Judith stubbornly denied any malicious intent, claiming Janelle was dismissed purely out of concern for infant health. The phone was locked to promote rest, and the food was portioned to prevent Mallory from developing entitled habits. "I may be strict," Judith insisted with wounded pride, "but who can prove I actually wanted harm to come to her?" At that exact moment, the front door opened, and Brooke walked into the living room carrying our mother's digital tablet computer. Brooke explained that she had stopped by earlier to update the operating software on the tablet. Because the tablet was linked to our mother's cloud storage, the photo gallery had automatically synchronized the image stream from her smartphone during the exact 2 weeks I was in Ohio. When Brooke set the tablet on the coffee table and began scrolling through the photo timeline, Judith's face drained of color. On the very morning Mallory had survived on stale bread and almond milk, there was a high-resolution photo of Judith enjoying an elaborate brunch with her social circle at an upscale bistro in town. On the following afternoon, when Mallory had waited hours for someone to return, there were photos of Judith attending a senior fitness luncheon, followed by an afternoon social gathering. The timestamps on those photos matched the exact windows of time during which Judith had claimed to extended relatives that she was confined to the house, tirelessly caring for her postpartum daughter-in-law. I was not angry that my mother had a social life. An independent woman has every right to spend time with friends. What chilled me to the bone was that she was fully aware of Mallory's physical vulnerability, deliberately left her without sustenance, and then publicly painted herself as a selfless martyr. Yet the piece of evidence that permanently dismantled her defense was a text thread Brooke opened between Judith and a close friend. The friend, noticing Judith out at lunch, had texted, "Your daughter-in-law just had a cesarean delivery. If you are out all afternoon, who is preparing her meals?" Judith's text response was brief, chilling, and definitive. "Let her figure it out herself for a few days. If I do not break her stubbornness from the start, she will expect the entire household to serve her just because she pushed out a baby." I stared at those words for several agonizing seconds. This was no longer Mallory's testimony, nor my personal deductions, nor an innocent generational misunderstanding. It was my mother's own written confession of deliberate, premeditated neglect. I set the tablet down on the table, looked directly at my mother, and asked a single question. "Mom, if Mallory had passed out on the staircase while holding Hazel in her arms, Who would have carried the responsibility for that tragedy? Judith sat in absolute suffocating silence. Finally, she muttered defensively that she never imagined Mallory was truly that weak, arguing that women in her generation resumed full physical work days after giving birth. "That is the entire problem, Mom," I replied softly. "You did not need to actively wish for a tragedy. You knew she was physically incapacitated, and you chose to withhold care to teach her a lesson. That alone is unforgivable." Brooke broke down in tears beside us, admitting that while she had spent her life defending our mother, she could no longer enable this toxic behavior. "Mom," Brooke said through tears, "if Mallory treated you the way you treated her, I would never defend Mallory either." That rebuke from her own daughter struck Judith harder than any words I had spoken. She sat paralyzed, suddenly invoking my late father's memory. She spoke of how she had raised us alone after his death, how she had managed every facet of this household, and how every boundary I established after marriage felt like a piece of her son being ripped away from her. For the first time, I saw that beneath Judith's ruthless need for control was a deep, terrified fear of obsolescence and abandonment. Yet understanding her psychological wound did not mean I could tolerate her abusive actions. "Mom," I said gently, "I know you fear ending up alone after losing Dad, but attempting to keep me close by crushing my wife will only end up driving me completely away." I laid down 3 non-negotiable boundaries moving forward. First, she would never make unilateral parenting decisions regarding Hazel. Second, she would never withhold or tamper with Mallory's personal property, communications, or finances. Third, once we moved into our apartment, any visits would require prior notice and mutual consent, just like any other relative. Judith gave a bitter, mocking laugh. "So, now you are setting legalistic terms for your own mother?" "These are not terms, Mom," I replied steadily. "These are the boundaries required if we are to have any relationship as mother and son at all." I also informed her that I was rehiring Janelle, paying her full rate to assist Mallory during her remaining recovery, so my in-laws would not bear the entire physical burden of our family's failure. Judith did not utter another protest. She silently initiated an electronic transfer, returning the advance deposit funds to my account. I stood up to leave. Just as I reached the entryway, Judith's voice rang out from behind me, sharp with sudden desperation. "Do you honestly believe I am the only one who wanted to establish authority? There are things about your precious wife before the delivery that you know nothing about." I paused at the door, but this time, I did not react with frantic curiosity. I turned and said calmly, "If you have factual evidence, show it to me completely. I am done listening to curated, one-sided stories." My mother grabbed her smartphone, opened a photo folder, and thrust the screen into my face with triumphant conviction. On the screen were 2 cropped screenshots of a private text conversation between Mallory and her college friend Paige. In one screenshot, Mallory had written, "If things remain this toxic after delivery, I am taking the baby to my parents' house. I will not consider moving back until Garrett agrees to sign a lease on our own apartment." In the second screenshot, Mallory wrote, "I already inquired about rental rates for a 2-bedroom unit near Garrett's engineering office. The monthly rent is well within our budget." Reading those messages, my heart sank. The fact that Mallory had contemplated moving out was not a complete shock, given the simmering tensions in our home. But discovering that she had secretly scouted rental properties prior to giving birth left me feeling blindsided and disheartened. Seeing my expression, Judith pounced immediately. "See? She planned this entire separation from the very beginning. I simply saw through her manipulation before you did." I did not react rashly. Looking closely at the screenshots, I noticed that every single message bubble was severed, devoid of any surrounding context or preceding dialogue. When I asked Judith where she obtained them, she admitted that while Mallory's phone was locked in the vanity, message preview banners had popped up on the lock screen, prompting her to photograph them as insurance in case I ever turned against her. That invasive breach of privacy deepened my distrust. "Send me the entire unedited chat export, Mom. Not 2 cropped fragments." Judith's face darkened. "The text is right there in black and white. What more context could you possibly need?" "A sentence ripped out of its context can turn the victim into the villain," I answered coldly. "I have already paid a devastating price for blindly trusting a curated narrative." Judith refused to provide full records, accusing me of desperately inventing excuses to defend my wife. Refusing to engage further, I stated that I would only evaluate the situation once the full truth was available, and drove back to Malvern. Back at my in-laws' house, Mallory was sitting near the window nursing Hazel. Without accusation or secrecy, I placed my phone on the table and asked her directly about the apartment inquiries. Mallory looked at the screenshots, her expression tightening, but she did not deny them. She explained that roughly a month before her delivery date, an explosive argument had erupted between Judith and her that she had deliberately kept from me. Judith had declared that, after delivery, Hazel would be confined strictly to our household for traditional rest, and that Mallory's parents would only be permitted brief daytime visits. When Mallory pushed back, asserting that parenting arrangements were strictly the decision of the biological parents, Judith had snapped, "If you want to run off to your parents after delivery, go right ahead. But this family's grandchild stays under my roof." Mallory paused, fighting back tears. She explained that as an expectant mother approaching major surgery, the threat of having her newborn withheld from her induced severe panic. Terrified that a crisis might erupt while I was traveling for work, she had reached out to Paige to research local rental rates near my engineering office as an emergency contingency plan. She had signed no leases, paid no deposits, and never intended to abandon our marriage. It was purely a protective contingency in the event that living together became untenable. Mallory looked at me with raw honesty. "Garrett, I made a mistake by not communicating this to you openly. But I was looking for a safe haven for our small family. I was never trying to leave you." Hearing her explanation, the ache in my chest intensified. What hurt most was not that she had researched apartments, but the agonizing realization that my wife had felt so vulnerable and unsupported that she had to secretly construct an escape route, convinced that confiding in her husband would yield nothing. "Why did you not come to me back then, Mallory?" I asked quietly. Mallory looked down at Hazel and answered softly, "Because in the past, every single time I brought up your mother's behavior, your default response was always to ask me to endure it just a little longer." That sentence shattered my remaining defenses. I had prided myself on being an objective mediator, but in reality, my mediation was nothing more than repeatedly demanding that the gentler partner absorb the damage, so the volatile partner would not erupt. I had preserved a superficial household peace at the direct expense of my wife's psychological safety. Mallory immediately texted Paige, requesting the complete, unedited export of their message history. When the full transcript arrived, the narrative was completely transformed. Directly preceding the message about moving out was Mallory's verbatim account of Judith threatening to withhold custody of Hazel. Paige had advised her that if the domestic environment was becoming hostile, she should proactively discuss leasing an apartment with me before the baby arrived. The phrase, "until Garrett agrees to sign a lease," was not a threat of separation, but an expression of her desperate hope that I would finally recognize the necessity of establishing an independent household. Crucially, the screenshots my mother had captured were cropped precisely to conceal her own verbal threats. Looking at the two contrasting records side by side, I realized that Judith had deliberately manufactured a false narrative to portray Mallory as a calculating saboteur. Mallory asked what I planned to do. I assured her that while I would establish the factual truth, I would not engage in a public smear campaign against my mother. "Protecting you does not require publicly humiliating my mother, Mallory. We will address the facts clearly, but I will not stoop to cruelty." I genuinely believed we could resolve this dispute with quiet, private dignity. I was entirely mistaken. The following morning, my phone erupted with urgent notifications. The call was from Brooke, her voice trembling with distress. "Garrett, open the neighborhood community forum and local social feeds right now. Mom has posted everything publicly." I opened the local community group application on my phone. Judith's public post was pinned near the top of the feed, spanning multiple lengthy paragraphs. She wrote a dramatic, tear-soaked narrative, claiming that she had dedicated her golden years to nursing her postpartum daughter-in-law, only for Mallory to manipulate her son into turning against his own mother and absconding with the newborn grandchild. While she avoided using Mallory's full legal surname, she included our family portraits, photos of Hazel in the nursery, referenced Mallory's corporate accounting profession, and detailed our neighborhood location with such specificity that any local acquaintance, colleague, or neighbor would instantly identify us. To substantiate her claims, Judith had attached the two cropped, out-of-context screenshots of Mallory's text messages with Paige, framing them as definitive proof of a premeditated plot to tear the family apart. She even included a vulnerable photo of Mallory lying in bed, immediately postpartum, hair disheveled and visibly exhausted, falsely captioning it as evidence of her own tireless, around-the-clock bedside care, while claiming she had been unjustly accused of neglect. Within hours, the post accumulated hundreds of reactions and sympathetic comments from local residents. Strangers denounced modern daughters-in-law, while acquaintances left scathing remarks accusing Mallory of being a manipulative person who had stolen a son from his devoted mother. Before I could shield Mallory from the public post, a colleague from her accounting firm sent her a private message containing a screenshot of the thread, asking if her family was all right. Mallory sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring at the screen, her hands trembling uncontrollably, though she did not shed a tear. Her first words to me were remarkable. "Garrett, please do not post Hazel's photos online to argue with anyone. Whatever disputes the adults have, our daughter must never be turned into a public spectacle." Her maternal integrity snapped me out of my reactive fury. My immediate impulse had been to publish Judith's full-text transcripts, the photos of her leisure lunches, and Janelle's financial receipts to completely destroy her false narrative. But doing so would have reduced me to the exact same toxic level, exposing our intimate family trauma to an online mob simply to secure a hollow victory. I called Judith immediately, demanding that she delete the post, remove Hazel's images, and take down Mallory's private communications. "Mom, no matter how intense this family dispute is, you have zero right to weaponize an innocent 3-week-old infant on social media." Judith's response was icy and defiant. "I am merely sharing the factual truth." If she had the audacity to plan this, she should have the courage to face public scrutiny. "If you are so dedicated to the unvarnished truth, Mom," I countered steadily, "why did you not post your text declaring that you intended to break Mallory's spirit? Or your message admitting that you deliberately starved her so she would not expect service?" Judith paused for 2 seconds, then snapped that I was blackmailing her. Refusing to back down, she doubled down in the public comment section, falsely claiming that my in-laws were actively holding the infant hostage and denying the paternal grandmother visitation rights. Recognizing the futility of arguing with her directly, I contacted the group administrators and platform moderation team, providing official documentation that the post contained unauthorized images of a minor, private medical context and defamatory allegations regarding an active domestic dispute. Following administrative review, the post was promptly removed to prevent further targeted harassment. Meanwhile, my in-laws handled the unfolding public embarrassment with extraordinary grace. When Mallory's aunt furiously offered to log on and expose Judith's entire history of deceit, Douglas stopped her immediately. Engaging in a public shouting match will only inflict long-term damage on Mallory. Online mobs move on to the next drama tomorrow, but Mallory still has a professional career and a community to live in. We handle this with dignity, not mudslinging. That afternoon, Brooke visited Judith's house, demanding that she issue a formal retraction and apologize for publicly humiliating Mallory and the baby. Judith lashed out at Brooke, accusing her of betraying her own blood. Brooke delivered a response that I will never forget. "Mom, Mallory might be an in-law to you, but to Garrett she is his wife. To Hazel she is her mother. You cannot force the entire world to view her through the lens of your personal resentment." Cornered by her own children, Judith's pride morphed into reckless indignation. She declared that if we believed she was lying, we should convene a formal family meeting with our extended relatives, claiming she was fully prepared to clear her name publicly. When Brooke relayed this, I agreed after careful deliberation. I had no desire for another shouting match, but allowing fragmented, toxic rumors to circulate indefinitely was unsustainable. I set 3 strict conditions. The meeting would be restricted strictly to immediate, involved family members. There would be 0 video recording or live broadcasting, and both sets of parents would be treated with absolute baseline respect. That evening, I compiled a chronological, documented dossier of the facts. Janelle's formal statements, the electronic banking refund records, the unedited transcripts between Mallory and Paige, Judith's premeditated text to Brooke, and her messages to friends while Mallory was left without food. I did not organize this dossier to humiliate my mother. I did it to ensure that the resolution of our family's future would be determined by objective facts, rather than whoever could cry the loudest or craft the most theatrical performance. When I told Mallory she was under no obligation to attend, she gently shook her head. "I will be there, Garrett. Not to fight with your mother, but to speak my own truth, so no one ever narrates my life for me again." The family meeting took place at the suburban home of Aunt Rosemary, the eldest and most respected matriarch on my father's side of the family. Aunt Rosemary was widely revered for her quiet wisdom, fairness, and refusal to engage in petty gossip. I intentionally selected her home as a neutral environment, ensuring neither side felt cornered on home turf. Before everyone was seated, I established the ground rules. We are here to resolve this with dignity. There will be no insults, no shouting, and no interruptions. Every issue will be addressed in chronological order with factual evidence. Judith sat upright on the main sofa, her posture rigid and unyielding. From the opening moments, she maintained that she had merely exercised traditional maternal discipline and had never intended physical harm. Postpartum mothers cannot expect to be treated like royalty, she asserted. I was simply encouraging independence. The two aunts who had previously accompanied her sat silently, observing the room. I began with the cancellation of the postpartum doula. I placed my phone on the center coffee table, dialed Janelle on speakerphone, and allowed her to recount her interaction with Judith. Janelle confirmed unequivocally that on the morning of my flight to Ohio, Judith had personally called to cancel her services, claiming that Mallory refused outside help. When I asked Janelle if Mallory or I had ever authorized that cancellation, Janelle answered with absolute clarity, "No, Garrett. You never contacted me to cancel." I then presented the electronic banking transaction, demonstrating that Janelle's refund had been deposited directly into Judith's personal bank account the following morning. Judith attempted to claim that she was merely conserving family funds. "If your sole intention was financial conservation, Mom," I asked steadily, "why did you conceal the cancellation from me? Tell me that Mallory requested it, and tell Janelle that we had mutually changed our minds?" Judith sat in stony silence, murmuring that she could not recall the exact phrasing from weeks ago. Brooke then retrieved her phone and read aloud Judith's premeditated text. "This time, I am going to teach Mallory a lesson about who holds the authority in this household." Judith waved her hand dismissively, claiming it was merely an exaggerated remark spoken in frustration. Without raising my voice, I presented the next message the text Judith had sent to her friend while Mallory was surviving on crackers. "Let her figure it out herself for a few days. If I do not break her stubbornness from the start, she will expect the entire household to serve her." The entire living room fell into dead, suffocating silence. The two aunts who had initially defended Judith looked down at the floor, unable to utter a single word of support. Aunt Rosemary let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking her head in profound disappointment. My mother's own written words had completely dismantled her defense. She had deliberately engineered Mallory's isolation to break her will. Desperate to shift the focus, Judith brought up the rental apartment, producing the cropped screenshots with Paige and accusing Mallory of plotting to take the baby and divide the family before she had even given birth. I unlocked my phone and displayed the complete, unedited export provided by Paige. I read the preceding messages aloud, revealing Judith's original threat. "If you want to run off to your parents after delivery, go right ahead, but this family's grandchild stays under my roof." The very evidence Judith had weaponized to accuse Mallory of malicious intent was revealed to be the direct consequence of her own coercive threats. For several minutes, the room remained entirely speechless. Mallory, who had remained quiet beside me, spoke up when Aunt Rosemary gently asked if she had anything to say to her mother-in-law. Mallory did not shed a tear, nor did she recount her physical suffering with dramatic flair. She looked directly at Judith and spoke with calm, undeniable dignity. "Judith, I never once expected you to wait on me hand and foot. If you were unwilling to assist me, all you had to do was return my phone or allow Janelle to do her job, and I would never have harbored a single grievance against you. What I cannot accept is that you stripped away every single resource I had to care for myself, and then pointed your finger at me, calling me useless." That simple, devastating truth summarized the entire ordeal. This was never about meals. It was about the calculated creation of forced helplessness to assert dominance. Judith turned to me, her eyes bloodshot, her voice cracking with bitter desperation. "So because of a few missed meals, you are truly prepared to abandon your own mother?" Looking at her, I felt only a profound, quiet sorrow. "Mom, this is not about missed meals. You took the most physically vulnerable chapter of my wife's life and turned it into an opportunity to break her spirit." An outspoken uncle sitting near the back, Uncle Stewart, muttered under his breath that Judith's behavior was utterly cruel. I immediately raised my hand to stop him. "Uncle Stewart, please. She is still my mother. We address the actions factually. We do not humiliate her character." Quote, I refused to let the meeting devolve into a communal mobbing of an elderly woman. Mallory looked at me, her eyes filled with deep, renewed trust. She saw that I was not switching from my mother's camp to her camp. I was upholding a fundamental principle of justice. The wrongdoer must be held accountable, but accountability must never devolve into the stripping of human dignity. I presented my mother with 3 final, non-negotiable resolutions. First, all remaining defamatory social media posts must be permanently deleted. Second, she must publish a clear, factual retraction stating that allegations of Mallory attempting to divide the family or withhold the grandchild were entirely false and misleading. Third, she was permanently prohibited from utilizing Hazel's image or likeness in any public or online domestic dispute without our explicit written consent. Judith refused the retraction outright, claiming that issuing a public correction would make her look like a liar in front of the entire community, destroying her social standing. You chose to broadcast a private domestic matter to the entire public, Mom, I replied calmly. The only way to correct a public falsehood is in the exact public forum where the lie was told. Judith stood up abruptly, declaring through clenched teeth that I would live to regret humiliating her, before storming out of Aunt Rosemary's home. I did not chase after her. I had hoped that laying out the objective facts before family would grant her the clarity to de-escalate. Instead, late that night, Judith published yet another inflammatory post on her personal social media profile, accusing my in-laws of alienating the grandchild and coercing me into abandoning my family home. Mallory read the post in silence, set her phone down, and told me she had zero desire to pursue drawn-out legal litigation. I agreed. I had no intention of dragging my mother into a criminal courtroom, but I explained to Mallory that establishing legal boundaries is not an act of vengeance. When an individual continuously disseminates defamatory material and weaponizes an infant's image to exert coercive control, silence is interpreted as permission to continue. Together with an attorney, we submitted formal cease and desist notifications and documented a formal civil grievance with the local municipal mediation department regarding ongoing online harassment and the unauthorized public exploitation of an underan engernace and an NTA, infant's likeness in a domestic dispute. Signing my name on that formal legal document brought me zero satisfaction. My hand trembled as the pen touched the paper. The woman named in the filing was my own mother. A few days later, an official municipal notice for administrative mediation and legal compliance was delivered to Judith's home. There were no flashing sirens or cinematic arrests. It was simply a certified legal notice resting on her entryway table. But for a woman who believed domestic authority granted her immunity from accountability, it was the first time she realized that public speech and harassment carry real-world legal consequences. During the formal administrative mediation session, I accompanied my mother not to justify her actions, nor to watch her be reprimanded, but because she was a woman in her 60s navigating a legal proceeding for the very first time. Regardless of her wrongdoing, fulfilling my baseline duty as a son meant ensuring she was not left entirely alone in a legal setting. Following the review of the digital dossier, Judith was formally ordered to permanently remove all defamatory materials, execute a concise written clarification on the original platform, and sign a binding civil compliance agreement, prohibiting any future unauthorized use of Hazel's image or public dissemination of private domestic claims. A standard administrative civil fine was assessed for the documented public harassment. Standing beside her as she signed the compliance documents, I felt no sense of triumph. I felt only a profound ache. The woman who had taught me from childhood to live with dignity had publicly humiliated herself out of a desperate, toxic obsession with conquering her daughter-in-law. On the drive back, Judith remained completely silent. As I pulled up to her front walkway, she turned to me with bitter tears. Does dragging your own mother to a municipal mediation office bring you peace of mind, Garrett? I looked at her for a long time before replying softly. Mom, my heart aches that it came to this. I begged you to stop countless times, but loving you does not mean I am obligated to let you continue hurting the people I promised to protect. Judith looked away, unable to answer. I knew the lesson was painful, but when an individual crosses every boundary of decency, gentle words are no longer capable of halting their trajectory. I required Judith to pay the administrative civil fine from her personal funds, not out of spite, but because I refused to use Mallory's money to cover the financial consequences of her own defamation. Nevertheless, I continued to ensure her daily well-being. I refilled her cardiovascular prescriptions on schedule, maintained our monthly financial contributions for her utility accounts, and called regularly to check on her health. I maintained a strict healthy distinction. Honoring my responsibilities to my mother was entirely separate from enabling her toxic behavior. As for our living arrangements, I followed through completely. I signed a 12-month lease on a bright 2-bedroom apartment located 20 minutes from my engineering office. It was not as expansive as the 2-story family colonial, but for the first time in years, stepping through our front door brought an overwhelming sense of profound, restorative peace. Mallory initially felt guilty about the extra monthly rental expense, but I assured her that peace of mind was priceless. She was able to rest without fearing every footstep in the hallway, and I was learning to build an independent nuclear family rather than relying on my mother's domestic control. Janelle returned to assist Mallory for 4 hours each morning, and Colleen visited regularly, always calling ahead to ensure her visits aligned with Mallory's schedule. Those simple courtesies taught me what true respect looked like. Supporting someone is not measured by how aggressively you insert yourself into their space, but by whether you honor their autonomy to choose. I also restructured my professional commitments with my engineering firm. For the first 6 months of Hazel's life, I declined extended out-of-state travel, delegating field deployments to junior engineers while managing logic programming remotely. I never again took it for granted that domestic care could simply be outsourced to family assumptions. One night, Hazel suffered a severe colic episode, crying for nearly 3 consecutive hours. Mallory was nursing her while fighting through sheer exhaustion, her eyes rimmed with red. I took Hazel into my arms, pacing the apartment living room until my arms went numb and my lower back throbbed with pain. Only as the morning sun crested the horizon did Hazel finally fall asleep against my shoulder. The next morning, while brewing coffee, I looked at Mallory and smiled. I used to think earning a salary was the hardest part of being a husband. Turns out, actually showing up when it matters is the real work. Mallory smiled, and from that day forward, the dynamic in our marriage transformed. She began speaking openly whenever she felt uncomfortable, abandoning her old habit of silently preparing an escape route. And I permanently erased the phrase, "just endure it for my mom," from my vocabulary, recognizing that repeatedly asking the gentler partner to yield is the fastest way to destroy their trust. Brooke also resolved her boutique's financial crisis through responsible restructuring. She liquidated excess inventory, renegotiated supplier payment terms, scaled down operational overhead, and successfully paid down her debts without touching a single dollar of our $18,000 maternity emergency fund. One weekend, while visiting Hazel, Brooke sat beside Mallory and confessed honestly, "Mallory, I used to think you were overly guarded with finances, but after managing my own debts, I finally understand. Every fund has a sacred purpose. Expecting my brother to gamble your maternity medical reserve on my boutique was completely unfair of me." Mallory smiled warmly and let the past remain in the past. From that moment on, their relationship flourished on authentic, mutual respect. I was immensely grateful that this crisis had not turned my sister into an adversary. The fact that our mother had acted wrongfully did not mean the rest of the family had to be torn apart. As for Judith, the most profound consequence she endured was not the administrative fine, nor neighborhood gossip. It was the reality that Hazel was no longer living under her roof. With Mallory's consent, I sent regular milestone photos of Hazel to my mother. Whenever Judith wished to visit, she was required to call in advance. Initially, she was deeply offended, complaining that visiting her own grandchild required scheduling an appointment. I explained patiently, once and for all, "Mom, asking for a courtesy call is not an appointment. It is baseline respect for our independent home." As the months passed, Judith's resistance gradually softened. One afternoon, when I brought her blood pressure medications to the 2-story house, the rooms were so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer echoed down the hall. Judith was sitting alone in the living room, looking at the empty wooden crib she had purchased before Hazel was born. The crib was pristine, covered with a light cotton sheet, having never held our daughter for a single night. Judith stared at the empty crib for a long time, before asking in a hushed whisper, "Garrett, does Mallory still hate me?" I did not offer a comforting lie. "Mom, if you want to know the answer to that, you will have to ask her yourself one day. But understand that an apology does not obligate someone to grant instant forgiveness. Expecting someone to immediately erase their pain just because you apologized is simply another way of forcing them to submit to your timeline. For the first time in her life, my mother did not argue. She sat in silence, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the empty crib. At that moment, I understood that her true reckoning was not found in the legal paperwork or neighborhood gossip. It was found inside the echoing walls of the house, where she had tried to maintain absolute control at all costs. The house remained standing. Her son still cared for her physical needs, but the infant grandchild she had tried to claim by force was growing up somewhere else. The tighter one attempts to grip another human being through coercion, the faster one pushes them away. Nearly a full year has passed since the day I carried Hazel out of that house. Our daughter is now pulling herself up on furniture, taking her first wobbly steps across the living room rug, and babbling her first sweet syllables, filling our home with laughter. Mallory and I still reside in our leased 2-bedroom apartment. Our finances are stable, and we could comfortably transition to purchasing a property. But we have mutually decided to continue living independently. A healthy physical distance does not diminish family love. Rather, it provides the clear boundaries necessary to preserve it. My mother's transformation has been slow and gradual. Real human change rarely occurs overnight like a scripted movie ending. In the early months, she still occasionally grumbled about feeling distant from her son. But as the months passed, those passive-aggressive comments faded. She began calling reliably before visiting, stopped attempting to dictate Hazel's dietary or sleep routines, and never again posted family photos online without our explicit permission. I cannot say whether her change was driven by profound moral enlightenment or simply the practical realization that crossing boundaries carried real consequences. But in the beginning, the underlying motivation matters less than the willingness to halt harmful behavior. Shortly before Hazel's first birthday, something unexpected occurred. Judith did not call my phone. She dialed Mallory directly. I was at my engineering office, only learning of the conversation when I returned home that evening. My mother had not called to demand a lavish family celebration or insist on hosting the party at her house. She simply asked, with genuine hesitation, if she could drop by to give Hazel a small sweater she had hand-knitted herself. Mallory admitted she had paused for a long moment before answering, not out of spite, but because deep emotional wounds require time to heal. Ultimately, Mallory agreed. When Judith arrived the next day, she brought no extravagant, performative gifts. She carried a small cloth bag containing a hand-knitted baby sweater and a container of freshly baked muffins. Looking closely at the sweater, I could see where she had patiently unraveled and restitched the wool multiple times to ensure the seams were even and soft. Judith sat on the sofa for a long time. Mallory set Hazel down on the foam play mat and sat across from her, while I stood near the kitchen counter without intervening. The atmosphere was not hostile, but it was not entirely relaxed either. People who have hurt one another deeply require quiet space before authentic connection can begin. Finally, Judith spoke first. She confessed that for decades, she had believed that when a son married, a mother inevitably lost her significance. Having raised 2 children alone after my father died, she had grown accustomed to being the ultimate authority, and every time I defended my wife, Judith had felt an acute, terrifying fear of abandonment. "Because I was so terrified of losing you, Garrett," Judith whispered, her voice trembling. "I tried to control everything. And in the end, my own actions drove you away." She turned to Mallory, her eyes glistening with genuine remorse. She offered no excuses about generational gaps or how tough women were in her day. "Mallory," she said softly, "I was terribly wrong to choose the most vulnerable moment of your life to force your submission. I do not expect you to forget what happened. I simply want to ask for your forgiveness." Mallory did not break down in theatrical tears, nor did she leap across the room into an embrace. She sat quietly for a long moment, met my mother's gaze, and answered with quiet grace, "Judith, I accept your apology, but rebuilding genuine trust takes time." Judith nodded earnestly. "I understand completely, Mallory. I truly do." I stood beside them, neither forcing Mallory to accelerate her forgiveness nor exploiting the moment to suggest moving back into the family house. A sincere apology deserves recognition, but a wounded person has every right to heal at their own pace. True reconciliation must stem from genuine emotional safety, not from social pressure to perform forgiveness. Following that afternoon, Judith visited occasionally, always calling ahead. On one afternoon, when Mallory was finishing a remote accounting project and I was delayed in highway traffic, Mallory proactively asked Judith if she could watch Hazel for an hour. Judith was overjoyed, yet she treated the request with deep respect rather than entitlement, asking Mallory for exact feeding instructions instead of altering routines. Their relationship has not transformed into an overly intimate bond, and I believe that makes it far more authentic. They have built a relationship on a modest, durable foundation, mutual respect, and clear boundaries. I, too, evolved tremendously through this crucible. I learned that being a devoted son does not mean blindly enabling a parent's toxicity. Allowing a parent to persist in destructive behavior is the ultimate disservice to them. Simultaneously, protecting one's wife does not require becoming an enemy to the woman who gave you life. I continue to provide for my mother's health and well-being, but I will never again purchase her comfort with my wife's suffering. Mallory once told me that what sustained her faith in our marriage was not that I had chosen her over my mother, but that she saw me take full, courageous accountability as a husband and father, refusing to force the gentler partner to absorb the damage. Our $18,000 emergency fund remains safely preserved in our long-term savings, serving as a future down payment on our permanent home. Brooke's boutique business has stabilized through diligent management, and she no longer expects family funds to bail out commercial risks. On Hazel's first birthday, we hosted an intimate family gathering at our apartment. Both sets of grandparents sat around the dining table, no lavish performance, no competitive posturing, and no debates over family hierarchy. When it came time for Hazel's birthday cake, Judith picked up a small spoon to offer her a bite. She paused, looked across the table at Mallory, and asked gently, "Mallory, may I give Hazel a tiny taste of the frosting?" It was a small, simple question, yet hearing it, my mind flashed back to the woman who had stood in the kitchen 12 months prior, screaming, "I am the mother of this house, not your personal maid." At that moment, I realized that true, transformative change does not manifest in grand, theatrical declarations. It reveals itself in the quiet humility of a person who once commanded absolute control, learning to pause, step back, and ask for permission. My mother paid a heavy price for her actions through legal accountability, financial loss, months of separation from her grandchild, and the quiet emptiness of her home. But I find no joy in that reckoning. We never wished for her to suffer. The true grace of this journey is that after enduring the consequences, she possessed the wisdom to change, while we kept the door to redemption open. Late that afternoon, Hazel gripped the edge of the coffee table, pulled herself up on her chubby legs, and took 3 unsteady steps across the rug. Mallory sat on one side, I sat on the other, and Judith sat a few feet away, her hands gently outstretched, waiting patiently without rushing forward. Hazel wobbled for a moment, turned her little head, and toddled straight into the arms of her grandmother. Watching my daughter rest her head against my mother's shoulder, I understood that genuine family love operates precisely like those first steps. The harder you attempt to pull someone toward you through force and manipulation, the more you frighten them away. But when you learn to stand in your proper place, maintain healthy boundaries, and wait with patient respect, love will always find its own way back. After everything we have weathered, I no longer believe that honor means blind obedience, nor that loving a partner means declaring war on your heritage. Being a responsible man simply means having the courage to see the truth. When someone is wrong, hold the line. When someone is vulnerable, stand as their shield. And when you have sworn an oath to protect the family you built, never wait until they are broken to remember what that promise truly meant.